For that, let me show you how a real error could occur here. We can simply manipulate this URL. Of course, that is an error you typically would be able to avoid because you as a developer add that URL. But since I have no influence on the server-side code here, I can't fake a server-side error. Hence, sending a request to an invalid URL is the best thing I can do right now. Let's remove .json at the end. This is something Firebase doesn't like, and if you then send a request to this invalid URL, Firebase will respond with an error message. So let's save that and reload, and everything is red. We see a bunch of red, so clearly this failed. We can handle such errors, which in this case actually is thrown by the browser here. We can handle such errors by adding another block in our then chain. After all those then blocks, we can add a catch method. So .catch on this long chain of thens and thens. Catch also works on promises, and it takes a function, I'll also use an arrow function here, which will be triggered whenever any error occurs related to the previous then blocks. So related to the original request or thrown in a later then block. Here we'll get the error, and here we can handle it. So here, for example, we can console log the error to get started. If I do that and reload, here, that's my console log. Of course, I'm not here to just log it. So instead, I want to show something to the user on the screen. Because typically, your users are not going to open the developer tools. So they just see loading, and they are wondering whether they will eventually see some data or not. So I want to improve this experience and show an actual error message to the user. Either a dialog or, in my case here, simply a message down there. And for that, we can simply manage another data property in the component where we are sending the request. The error property, for example. The name is up to you though. Doesn't have to be error, like for all those properties. Initially, I'll set it to null, because initially we have no error, but down here, we do have an error. So here I'll set this error equal to failed to fetch data, please try again later. Of course, you could also analyze this error object which you're getting and see if you got more details there and show a more specific error message to your users. That really depends on your application, which kind of errors you want to handle, and so on. But this at least is a generic error message that tells the user that something went wrong. So here, I now want to use error to show an error message. For that, I'll add another paragraph here with v-else if in that long block of v-else statements, and check if we're not loading, because of course if we're loading I definitely don't want to show the error message, and if I have an error. And if I do, I simply output the error here, because error is simply set to a string here, so of course we can just output it in our template. And now we can also use v-else here in the end, because we know if we reach that block here, we will have results which we can output, because we're handling all other cases before we handle this case here. Of course, I also want to reset error whenever we send a new request. So when we start sending a new request here, when we set is loading to true, I'll also set error back to null to reset the error at this point. And now with that, my project here complains that this error argument is never getting used, so I will console log it here like this. Alternatively, we simply leave that blank, but I want to show you that you would get this error object that was thrown as an error here. And therefore with that, if I reload, we still see a loading. Let me check why. Oh yeah, because of course here I'm just checking if we're loading, and if we are, I'm always setting loading. Now the problem is we are loading if we get an error, because we only set isLoading to false if we're able to read some data, which is not happening here if we catch an error. So of course we should set this is loading to false here in the error case as well, because we are not loading anymore. We weren't successful, but we're not loading anymore, so we need to reset this here as well. But I also noticed another issue, the order here. We're checking if we're loading, but thereafter we're checking if we're not loading, but then if we maybe got no result data. And if that's the case, we'll show our no data message. Actually, I want to switch the order and first check if we have an error, so that this overrides the no data case, and we show the error message instead of the no data message if we have an error. So with all that, let's save that. And now if I reload, we see this failed to fetch data message here. On the other hand, if we do fix this URL here, if I add .json, then you see if I reload, the data gets loaded and displayed correctly again. And if I delete my data here, let's check this case as well. If I now load the data, we see the no data message. And if I add data again and then load it, that works. So now this is also how we can handle errors.